Vivienne, the Deputy Chair now of Westwards, and it's just such a joy to be sitting here with Zaheda. It's not something that happened instantly. It's taken 3 efforts to finally happen. First of all, it was an earthquake, then it was the death of the Queen, but here we are tonight. Rather wet night that's kept a few people away, but we're here, which is just wonderful. Now, for those of you that don't know, Zaheda arrived with her family in the 1980s as a refugee, and when she was 9, she wrote her first story in a diary that was scented and it had a lock and key. And I think you entered that in a competition at some point, and that won you a prize, which you can talk about. But what was in that story, I think, was the kernel of what is in this absolutely beautiful book, which I've now had the pleasure of reading twice. This book is just the most beautiful. It's a very sort of deeply moving story of love and loss and exile, and it's poetic and it's lyrical and it's almost musical at points. I can almost sort of hear the music in the background as I'm reading it. It really is a beautifully poetic book from the very first word. Now, the first part of the book is set in the city of Herat, which according to Wikipedia is set in the west of Afghanistan, and it's an ancient city, an oasis city set on the Silk Road, yes. And we begin there in the years prior to the Russian invasion, which for those of us old enough to remember, and I remember it happened in 1979, the central family lives a pretty halcyon existence, and as I said, the hot's so evocative. We can sort of smell the fruits and the trees and the marketplace and so much. So what did you draw on, Zaheda, to construct such a detailed, sort of richly evocative picture of that city? And have you been there?
Sure. So there's a few sources of inspiration there. Firstly, growing up in my family and the friends that I have whose families are also from Afghanistan, it's quite hard not to be told about what life used to be like before the war. And so I had grown up with many stories of descriptions of the time. So that was kind of the basis or a source of inspiration to begin with. But then on top of that, there's a lot of content online and videos and stories and blogs and photos, which I kind of used to put the background together. It was really important for me to put the backdrop as close as I could possibly imagine for the story to work as a whole and for the characters' lives to be believable. And I think there's a romance to how things were before they all blew up. And I was hoping to capture that in the language and the descriptions of that time before everything erupted.
And I think you've done that marvellously. For the people who are here in the audience, maybe you could read
Sure.
the first couple of pages, which really sets that scene. And we don't want to give it all away because probably not everybody's read the book, and we want you all to buy it and read it. Oh, hang on.
Maybe I'll read a bit up to there, maybe?
Yeah, I was thinking even,
Yeah.
the first couple of pages, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay, right. So it opens with a quote by Rumi and how he describes Herat as an ancient city. If anyone asks thee which is the pleasantest of cities, thou mayest answer him aright that it is Herat. For the world is like the sea, and the province of Khorasan like a pearl oyster therein. The city of Herat being as the pearl in the middle of the oyster. And we talk about touchstones when we're writing or creating, and this was a bit of a touchstone throughout for me to kind of go back to always remembering an essence of what I wanted to write. And so I kind of used that as the opening for the chapter as well. The youngest daughter of Khoja and Koko is so delicate that the 120-day winds of Herat could blow her away. Her bones are made from porcelain, rigid and fine. A diaphanous girl in cotton dress and pantaloons, she's lifted high above Herat to the height of the ancient minarets of Queen Gauhar Shad and carried to a far corner of the world. As she floats, her hair twists and wraps itself around her white face, enfolding the arch of her long, slim nose and the glass lids of her large, closed eyes. Friends and family tell her lovingly that she is too sickly, too thin. She is not beautiful by the standards of the time, which prefer curves and flesh. Her two rose-cheeked, curvaceous sisters, Narges and Roya, are considered beauties by all. But they become jealous because their beauty doesn't seem to be enough, because she receives so much more attention. They do the chores around the large house. They study through the night for exams. Henna studies alongside them. She stays awake all night to feed her brain, to replace her lack of beauty with an abundance of knowledge.
Yeah.
Good? Enough? Yes.
Very nice. So Henna, obviously we've begun with her, but she's the central character. But there are two other main characters. She eventually does get married to Rahim, and she's got a beautiful brother called Hamid. I don't know if I got the pronunciations quite right. Mm-hmm. Yet, despite her fragility and the fact that she's got these two robust, curvaceous sisters, and Henna is a very slight thing, she somehow seems quite modern in that she doesn't want to get married. She's not like the sisters. She loves her career. She's very educated. And there's a kind of almost this modern quality to her. And sort of, could you tell us how you fleshed out that character of Henna?
Sure. So she's became my first interest because if I take a step back, so I thought I was going to write a true story of some family. And if I go way back to the beginning of the diary you mentioned, I thought I was going to write the story of the 9-year-old that I was. And that was inspired by reading When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit, which is the story from the eyes of a 9-year-old's family. Mm-hmm. That's where I learned this journey that my family had was a refugee story, because that's how she talks about her family in that novel. And so when I realized that I didn't really want to write a memoir or autobiography or a biographical novel or anything like that, it became a very freeing feeling, because now I could go anywhere that I was interested in. And she's the first character that really vividly appeared in my mind's eye to say, my gosh, I'm really interested in that. And so many rewrites, and I don't know if your writing process is similar, but it's mine is kind of, I have to really polish a certain aspect before I can go to the next thing. And so she formed out of this, I guess, and you talked about music, and that's really weird because that is what it was like. It's kind of this poetry, the music of the time, listening, wondering and thinking about what would a character do in this kind of backdrop, and then she kind of came through. And I originally had about 5 characters in total, and I ended up with the 3 main. Yeah. But she was the first one that really appeared out of the music and the feeling of it. It's almost like a feeling when I think about the world that she's in, and then she was kind of born out of that.
There's such an economy of words. It really is, and because it's an interesting book in that there's the 3 characters, and they each are in a chapter, and a chapter might be all of 2.5 pages or 1.5 pages sometimes. And it's told in the present tense, which is quite interesting. What made you do it that way? It makes it very active.
Sure, I've written it in a past tense, and it felt dead, like a bit cardboard, and it's a bit that feeling of eating dry Weet-Bix. So when I used to read it, I used to just not like it. And then when I wrote it in the present tense, I realized actually everything I write is in the present tense. That's where I find the movement and the presence, and the words come easily. And I chose to write, for me, I don't write long chapters. They're almost like vignettes. Mm-hmm. And so I initially had all these vignettes from these 5 or 6 characters' perspectives, and then I became interested in these three, and then the others were absorbed in their narratives. And so initially the vignettes or the chapters were even shorter.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, there's a real pace to it. At no point is there's an economy there that's really quite great, and because you cover a lot of time and you cover a lot of territory, a lot of human emotion, and yeah, it's you've done that really nicely. Her brother is perhaps without a doubt, the most kind of tragic character of all. He's quite a heartbreaking character, and life is not great for him, and he's witnessed he feels partly responsible, I think, for the suicide of his close friend that happens. We learn about that after that's actually happened, just without giving too much away, what were you wanting to create with Hamid and his story and the sadness that goes with him?
Sure. I didn't set out to do this, but somebody was reading the manuscript at one point and said, you know what, Hamid's story is a bit of a metaphor for the story of Afghanistan itself. And because his journey is a bit where he's recovering from that trauma, but he just never seems to get it right, and things outside his control, and as well as, you know, in his own journey as a character in trying to find himself. And so I didn't set out to try to do that, but he has that element of, I guess I was interested in what happens to a certain kind of youth that if the normal strong characters like the Rahims and the Hannahs, and as you said rightly, Hannah herself doesn't feel herself strong, and her journey is about finding her own strength later. And how, you know, in contrast, you've got Rahim, who is externally and internally quite a strong character. If they're disrupted in their identities by the conflict and violence of war, what happens to a character that is already fragile?
Yes.
And so I was interested in, ultimately the interest is in, what does war experience do to identities as a whole? And so I guess for me, Hamid was interesting because he was already kind of broken, and therefore he was going to have a different experience to those other characters who all have their own, you know, quirks and sides. But yeah,
there's quite a dramatic scene with the Russian invasion, and I mean, there's sort of parallels with what's happening in the Ukraine at the moment, coming into a country and the brutality that's there. And Hamid tries to help somebody and gets injured himself. And I mean, he's never quite the same, and he ends up in exile along with so many people. And it's really quite sad because he never quite finds himself. I wondered for a while whether he was maybe gay, but I don't think that was necessarily the case. You don't make that clear, but he seems to have at one point a relationship with a woman, and he almost relieved that there's somebody there that he can feel some deep emotional attachment to beyond his sister, because he's terribly attached to his sister. And of course at this point she and her husband have had to flee post that invasion. The book's called Pomegranate and Fig, and throughout it we're presented with the marvellous aromas of fruits, both in Afghanistan, in India, even Australia. There's because this is this 3-nation journey that the 2 lead characters take. Tell us about the meaning of fruit.
Sure. Fruit is kind of a big part of Afghan food discourse, and pomegranates especially have all these connotations and meaning and poetry, and so in order to try to be as close as possible to my authenticity of the experience of the culture, it was important to talk about the food as well as the fruits, and as well as the reality that families grew their own and had and this the life that Hannah grows up in is on this kind of farm and on all of that as well. So it was important to keep that as a theme for me, because it's such a real part of Afghan culture as well.
And it almost seemed that fruit means sanctuary, because I guess for fruit trees to grow and produce, it takes time and constancy, and those just meant that life was going to be okay when you had access to those beautiful fruits.
Absolutely.
And I mean, just on that, and my friend over here, Anna's just been in Pakistan, and sent beautiful photos of the valleys and the sort of productive areas. We see so many scenes when we see the news of areas that don't seem productive. So it's really wonderful to read and hear about the richness of the food and the quality of the produce that's in Afghanistan. There's a lot of sadness of lives being pulled apart, and you know, at one point, as we've said, after the invasion, the only real way of hoping for a better life is for them to leave so desperately, sadly, their family that they know in Herat, and then move to India, and from there onwards, years afterwards, to Australia. It must be hard now seeing what's happened, and I mean, I don't want you to go anything that feels too painful, but just watching what's happened now post the return of the Taliban.
I think it's, for me, it's sad as a woman, as a Afghan woman, because I guess what we're hearing is shocking in terms of a lack of rights to education and all of those basics of humanity, basic human needs. And so in the broader sense, I guess for me the sad part is that this is a global challenge of humanity on beyond Afghanistan. So we recently, the refugee and displaced population crossed the 100 million mark, and that wasn't a milestone we would have wanted to reach as humanity. And so it kind of is just one other source of I guess the sadness we have to overcome, it's hard to watch.
And I noticed that you've got a position on, I don't know whether you still do, the UNHCR, which you cleverly wrote into the book. Not so much your position, but you just mentioned it, which was a great thing. Is that, I mean, what you do is tell the story in such an engaging way of being a refugee in the country, in a different country, and having, I mean, this family they were very middle class people, both Hannah and Rahid, and there's a point in Delhi where Rahid is buying some onions, and he has to pay for them and weigh them himself. And he obviously comes from a well-to-do part of the world in Herat, where those things are all done by servants and whatever. And suddenly here he is doing the most basic things himself. And it's just a small thing, but you just get an idea of the indignities that people who just get transplanted to a new place, and they've come from something where they had a position in society, and suddenly they don't have anything. I mean, was that a strong wish for you to be able to describe those challenges?
Sure. It was important to try to be as real as I could from the perspective of the characters. So one of the things that I thought about while creating that experience was trying to imagine if that happened to me today. Mm-hmm. And if there's one thing you can say about the refugee experience is that it's not a choice. Mm-hmm. And there is a need to flee. And so if that happened to any of us, and tomorrow nothing that we are used to was going to be the same, then it would be little things that would trigger that loss. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to capture the contrast between what was before and what was now. And so that was one of the devices to use to kind of try to illustrate how he was growing up in an environment where things just were there. And now he was having to think about pennies and weigh things.
And Hannah takes in sewing, which she becomes the strong one in that pair. In that relationship.
Yeah. They kind of switch roles, don't they? Because basically you know, he starts off thinking he's going to have to do everything, and he's used to being that character that leads in his life and in public. And it ends up that he understands that he doesn't have to do it all alone. And she's kind of has an active imagination, but not necessarily living that. And she ends up really being the rock for the family as well. So
She really does.
yeah.
Now, your home here is Western Sydney, and I love the fact that you got married in the Rooty Hill RSL. It just couldn't get any more Aussie than that. And we're sitting today at West Words, which has had a big role, I think, in the development of your book. And do you want to just tell people here about that?
Sure. So Westwards is one of those magical things that happened on my journey, because, and I can talk a bit about how that influenced my journey. So I entered the fellowship, and the manuscript was picked up by the panel. And I remember speaking, I think it was with Michael, and he said, look, the panel's chosen not to partner. And actually, so as a result of the fellowship, you got a mentoring opportunity, which was really amazing for me. And so, and he said, well, the panel has decided that your mentor is going to be an editor, not another writer. We believe that's what you need. And I remember thinking, gosh, look at this care and wisdom of wanting to support my manuscript, and thinking, well, this was the original thing, but this particular manuscript needs this other thing. So he was like, hang tight, we'll find someone. And so I got teamed up with Alison Fraser, who is such an amazing human being and editor. And she helped me workshop lots of different structures. I wasn't that sure about how I wanted it to be structured. So we workshopped all these different structures, and she came in with more of the technical, here is the edits, and then we had all these, a lot of conversations which helped me refine and find my voice in where I wanted to take the novel as well. So.
And now, I mean, that's just such an achievement to get a book published by Hachette, which is, I mean, possibly the top publishing house in the world. Seriously, and that's just really, really remarkable. What's next for you? Is there another book on the go?
Yes.
I mean, you've got so much spare time. She's got a great tech job at Atlassian, and anyway, you must have
writing's a part of my day-to-day routine. So I'm working on a second novel, and I am thinking about a world where what would happen if everything continued from that 1979 era and no wars happened. What would be that Afghanistan today? And so that's the backdrop that I've put together, against which is a large family. I've got too many characters again, but we'll see what happens to them and what their journey is. So that's kind of where I'm looking at the moment.
Wow. That just really does sound fantastic. Just finally, you did talk about that little short story that you wrote in the very first instance, and it's very lovely because Zaheda has actually put it at the back of the book, and it's quite brief. And I wonder whether we could conclude by you reading that.
Happy to. So I wrote this as part of just a writing course I was doing in my 20s maybe, or earlier, and it got read at the opening of the Welcome Wall. When
yes,
that
the
launched many years ago, and so I read that there, so that was kind of my first experience of sharing it. So it's just a prose piece, so I can read that now. Paper is falling from the sky. I am in the garden, it's a sunny day. It comes back to me in slow motion. I am 3 years old. My father is often amazed at the fact that I should remember this far back into my childhood. I tell him these are unforgettable memories. The paper continues to fall. Communist propaganda rains down on us. The helicopters are so noisy, so high up in the sky. I stand looking up. My arms are wide open. I want to catch all the pieces of falling paper. At least it's better than when they shower us with bullets. Mother is at school across the street. She is a teacher. You can see the school when you go outside the huge walls of my grandparents' property. The walls made of thick hay and mud. I remember the walls. The height of them makes me feel protected. I imagine these walls to be strong enough to stop the rockets. I go inside the house to play behind the big blue couch in the lounge room. That's where we hide when the sirens sound in the middle of the night. One night I hear my father pray for us to die together if we are hit. That night he holds Mother and I close to him. I can feel him shivering as I secretly share his dua. I've never seen Father frightened before. Now I play with my big red doll when it happens. I hear a loud noise. I know it's a bomb. I run out into the garden. I find my hand in my aunt's hand. I am being pulled behind her. Small feet trying to catch up. Everyone gathers outside. Smoke rises from the direction of the school. I see it come over the wall. The noise deafens my ears. There is screaming and shouting on the other side where Mother is. We run out of the gates into the street, though I am hesitant, as I don't want to see her pieces lying before me. She would have been coming home for lunch now. All I see is smoke. My heart has stopped, my knees shake. I know she's gone. Everyone is crying. I watch the smoke. I don't say a word. My grandmother holds me, my head at her chest. I want Mother to walk out of the smoke. That's all I want. I break free of my grandmother. I stand alone, but I do not cry. After that, I don't remember what happens, but what I do recall is my mother running out of the smoke. She runs towards me. I'm in her arms. I can smell her. She smells of Mother. She holds me tight. She cries as she whispers, "We have to get away from here." My mouth is dry.
Thank you. Very, very beautiful. Just before we get on, and if there's any questions, you're very welcome to ask some questions, but I've been told to tell you, all of you, that we can buy the book today, and Zaheda is, I think, going to sign some copies.
Sure.
There's a special deal, and you can get, it normally sells for $32.99, but it's selling today for just $30, or 2 copies for $50. And I can vouch for the fact that they really would make beautiful presents, Christmas presents. Questions, anybody? This is your chance to speak to the author of a Hachette publication.
Thank you.
Anybody got anything to ask?
I've got a question. So, is the story your story, or is it how? I'm just interested in developing your characters. How you sort of your parents' story and your journey here. How did you develop from there?
Sure. Sure. It's not my story, which is kind of the fun part of the imagination. However, there are parallels because my family left Afghanistan because of that same war, and we did end up with India and Australia as the destinations for us. However, the rest is the characters are my stories are all starting with interesting characters and a time, and that's kind of the rest is imagination. Yeah.
So, where did your interest and passion for writing develop?
That's a good question.
So I remember when we first arrived in Australia, I was in year 6, I think, and there was this amazing teacher who took me under her wing. She kind of knew some of our story, and she introduced me to the library and to books and to this novel or biographical novel, When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit by Judith Kerr. And I remember my first experience of having novels read to me was in 5 when we had just arrived, and the teacher used to sit inside the library. We would be all on the floor. She'd be up on a chair. She'd be holding a book like this, and she'd be reading. And I remember from there thinking, I one day want to have my book in someone's hand being read like this. And ever since I remember, I wanted to write, and that's my earliest memory of it. And I don't think I've ever been in a bookshop without wishing I had a book on the shelf of my own.
Wow.
And so this has been a dream as far as I can remember into childhood.
And your first published
And
book
so
is
when
by
you-
Hachette.
At school, did you develop your creative writing?
Absolutely. So I was known for sometimes writing stories when I should be focusing on the maths. And so, so I've written since those young days. Actually, the diary story is a tragedy because what used to happen is in kind of that year 5 and 6 starting to write, I used to enter these little competitions Sydney Morning Herald used to run, and I sent this diary, but I didn't win anything. I didn't even get it back after I sent it.
What?
Because the thing is that they wanted a long story.
Yes.
And I had it there, and it was written by hand in a pencil. So I literally put it into an envelope, sent it off, and never saw it again.
Oh, that is a tragedy. It's a historical document.
It's crazy, yeah. So it's
when you win the Nobel Prize. Gosh.
But yeah, I've written ever since.
Yes. Peter?
Was there much of a diaspora of Afghanis or is it Afghans in Australia in the 1970s? I remember I met 70s before the war. I met a youngish man then who was studying at the ANU and I was studying political science, I think. He came from a family connected with the government in Afghanistan in 77. The war came, he never went back. And he remained an academic, and there were Afghan people there in Canberra at the time.
Right.
Was there much of it, or was he just a unicorn?
Yeah, I don't know about Australia. I have heard that people travelled quite a lot in the 70s during peacetime. So I've heard, and one of my characters has a bit of a story around going to Germany for a while. So I know that people used to travel to Europe and all over. I just don't know about Australia specifically.
There were the Afghan traders originally, of course.
Of course, yes, that's right. Yeah, the Cameliers.
Yeah.
And now is there much of an Afghan community in Australia?
There is, yeah.
Victoria,
Yeah.
Yes.
in some of the big towns.
Yeah, I don't know how big the population is in Australia. I don't come across Afghans all the time in kind of lots of contexts, but I know that there's a community, and obviously we're part of that. So.
What about you lot up the back? You event organisers who are doing your work experience from North Ryde High School?
Ryde Secondary.
Ryde Secondary. Have you got any questions?
I think it's like for us, we haven't experienced what has been experienced, and I guess we're still kind of recent to all this news of Taliban and stuff. So I think it's we're just not that we don't have that much of a context. So I think that it would be an interesting book for you to expand our knowledge of things. And what I've been listening to, a lot of the words make me a bit sad sometimes.
Yeah.
Other people in the world are also, children are just seeing bombs happen.
Yeah.
It's not that nice to see.
No. No.
How long did it take you to write the novel?
So I, many years, so I would say when I got serious about it, it was 2017, and then 2018 I got very serious about it. I would say it's written in 35 increments, 35-minute increments before work every morning over a few years.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
You're so disciplined. Heavens, wow. Anybody else, or are we?
So have you written your own story, or do you intend to ever?
Yeah, there's nothing interesting there, if I'm honest.
I think it sounds interesting.
Boring. Other lives are more interesting. I don't think I'll ever do that actually. Kind of feels a bit dry.
Maybe for you.
I wondered how much of you there was in Henna.
No, Hannah and I are very different.
Okay.
She's special.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. You people, it's a dreadful night out there, and I know there are a few people that fell by the wayside, and thank you to our trainee event organisers up the back who are, one's gone home I think. Look, on behalf of West Words, thank you so much for coming, and in particular, giant thanks to you, Zaheda. And you've got a lot to be proud of with that book.
Thank you. That's kind of.
And I wish you and you well.
Thank you. That's kind of.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.